First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to Canberra. It's great to be here, and after the, apropos of the last session, the wettest winter in the UK since records begun. It's wonderful to see the sun. It's a bit unusual. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And let me begin by talking about where we were until recently. We've been talking a lot about food in the last few years, and I think that the last time we really we were really concerned about macro food policy was way back in the 1970s. And this was a time of limits to growth. It was the time of Paul Ehrlich's hugely influential book, The Population Bomb. And I reread The Population Bomb quite recently, and it's a weird book. I mean, it's predicting the end of democracy in various places in Europe. And in some ways, it's easy to laugh about it now, but given what Ehrlich and people knew in the 1970s, it was by no means absurd. But what changed was that we had the Green Revolution. We found ways of producing food in much more food, more efficiently than we had done before, albeit with effects on the environment. And so the Green Revolution headed off the worries of the 1970s in exactly the same way that the Industrial Revolution had headed off the Malthusian worries at the end of the 18th century. And in fact, the major policy issue in the rich world over the last 40 or 50 years has been overproduction of food and how one can maintain rural economies in high-wage countries. And there have been different solutions to that. I have dual nationality, New Zealand and UK, and the two countries have had very different ways of doing that. New Zealand got rid of all its agricultural subsidies almost overnight, and the agricultural sector was then saved by having the enormous Southeast Asian market. We in the UK, as part of the EU, we moved our subsidies from production into things such as single farm payments, which have all sorts of perverse effects, which I won't talk about now. And in the poor world, we had the time of the Washington Consensus, where we took money essentially out of interventions in agriculture and food production and concentrated on macroeconomic interventions. And there has been extraordinary progress on hunger, perhaps less on malnutrition, over those 40 or 50 years. Although still, and we must always remember that, probably around 800,000 people go to bed each night calorie hungry. So that's where we were until 2005, and then we had the 2008 price shock, and a period of volatility that's lasted since then. The blue is the real price, and the red is the nominal price. And I put both up because when you correct for inflation, essentially using American CPIs, then you probably underestimate the effects that food prices have on the poorest, both the poorest in the rich world and the poorest in least developed countries. So the red, the nominal prices, actually tell you more what's being experienced by the poorest people. And we still don't quite know why that happens. The approximate causes of it, there was clearly some weather shocks. There is some discussion about whether flow of capital into commodities from subprime mortgages and other things had an effect. I personally don't think that was a major cause. The stock-to-usage ratios at that time for the major grains were very low. But in essence, I'm less interested in the proximate causes, but the ultimate causes. And I think that the food price volatility, the secular increases in food prices that we've seen recently, reflect market fundamentals. They reflect the growth of population, now gone through 7 billion, is heading somewhere between 9 or 10 billion, depending on really quite subtle things about that will happen in the next decade. And it's not only that we have more people, but those people are wealthier, which is a good thing. We want people to come out of poverty, and demanding a more varied diet. And these are some FAO figures on livestock consumption. That's what we're eating in the developed nations. We can't really stuff down more meat than we do already. And in fact, in some places, certainly in Europe, it's beginning to go down very slightly. But meat consumption in China is rising. Very interestingly, not in India, going through a similar economic trajectory, but for complex economic, social, religious reasons, meat consumption, at least as yet, hasn't increased. So we are going to see really major secular increases in demand for food over the, well, we have seen it and we will continue to see it. So what are the coming challenges? Well, the coming challenges, as I've just said, this continuing demand for food. But we have a very different world than even 10 years ago. So many of the people in what Paul Collier at Oxford calls the bottom billion, which used to be disconnected from global markets and food, and now in some of the big tropical megacities. In Africa, the Lagoses, the Nairobis, the Dar es Salaams. So this urbanization, this large concentration of people who are now exposed to global food prices in a way that they weren't even a decade ago. I think this is probably the biggest thing that has changed in the global food system over the last 10 to 20 years. And I think we're largely, at least in the policy world, we're largely unaware of quite how important that is. We caught a glimpse of it in the Arab Spring. You would be foolish to say that food prices alone were the cause of the social unrest that led to the Arab Spring, but they were certainly part of it. And then we also have on the demand side the challenges of obesity and non-communicable diseases that we heard so much about yesterday from Colin. And then on the supply side, so we're seeing these demand side pressures just at the same time as we're seeing a series of supply side pressures. The three of us have shared our presentations, and I know that Julian's going to be talking quite a lot about this in the next slide. So I'll say nothing more to comment, except the thing that worries me most is water, which I suspect, talking to a largely Australian audience, I don't have to say, competition for land and issues of land degradation. I'm also worried about resilience to shocks. So we're all, I think, have our fingers collectively crossed that something horrible doesn't happen in the Black Sea and the Crimea at the moment. And of the many things that might happen if Crimea and the Ukraine goes wrong, 15% of world wheat exports go through Sevastopol and the ports in those regions. So we have limited resilience to shocks. And of course, climate change. One thing I'll say on climate change, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but this is the AGMIC project. It's a really valuable project. It's getting together all the economists in the world who are trying to predict what happens in the future to the global food system, using a combination of partial equilibrium and global equilibrium models. And they got together and they stress tested their models with the same set of scenarios. And in the journal PNAS just before Christmas, they published their first results. And the results I'm showing there is what the additional effects on food prices of climate change. The baseline effects are so variable that I'm not sure how valuable showing them are, but the additional effects of climate change, I think, are interesting. And the critical thing there is, you sort of work through the effects on yields, the endogenous responses, etc., is that the median effect of climate change is a 20% increase in food prices, plus all the macro effects you'll get from increased demand. So climate change and food are intimately linked. We've got to look at those things together. So what are the responses? And for my remaining 10 minutes or so, I want to talk about some of these responses and sketch what I think are some of the important priorities. And I'm going to call on some of the results that from a project that the UK government set up that I had the privilege of chairing, the Foresight project and the future of food and farming. And what we tried to do on the Foresight project was to look both at the macroeconomics of the food system, the balance of supply and demand within the context of the governance of the global food system, but to look through everything through the twin prisms. So in addition to the macro effects, the twin prisms of the needs of the poorest, the imperative to end hunger, both calorie hunger, malnutrition, micronutrient hunger, and also through the prism of sustainability. The fact that the way we produce food now is literally unsustainable. We produce food now in a way that will undermine our capacity to produce food in the future. And then I think an interesting question, especially in the School of Public Policy, is what are the public policy responses? And of course, there are some guys out there, some of the more fundamentalist wings of the economics movement, who say, well, actually, we can allow the hidden hand to provide all the answers. That actually one doesn't need to intervene. The economic system will respond. And then on the other hand, you have the people who say, food is far too important to be left to the economy to sort out. We need a command process to determine all parts of it. And clearly it's going to be somewhere in the middle, and there will naturally be some endogenous response. And I think the way to look at the policy, at where best to put policy effort and policy money, is to explicitly look for market failures and where you need to put policy interventions in. One of the conclusions we had in the Foresight report was that a dispassionate look at the challenges ahead, as Quentin implied in his introduction to these three talks, is that if you look at it as a reasonable person, the challenges ahead are such that it makes sense to work on all aspects of the food system, on the supply side, on the demand side, and on governance. I'm going to say a little bit about each of them. I'm going to start off with the demand side. And the conclusion that we have in the Foresight report, and it's the same conclusion that a variety of other reports have come out, is that what we need to do is to produce more food, which we call intensification, although that's a contested word, but we need to produce more food in a more sustainable manner. So the mantra for this approach is this term sustainable intensification, which, as I said, a variety of reports have come up with, and this has been enthusiastically taken up by some people. The Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, FAO, now has sustainable intensification. Part of industry, Syngenta, now also use it, but it's also led to a backlash. So this is Friends of the Earth calling sustainable intensification a wolf in sheep's clothing. Compassion and World Farming, who care about animal welfare, terribly worried about intensification, calling it an oxymoron. So I want to spend one slide trying to argue what I mean by sustainable intensification, and in questions, please come back and argue it. And I think there are 5 premises behind sustainable intensification. And the first is that if you argue that one needs sustainable intensification, it doesn't mean that one need not take action on demand or on governance. So action on all fronts are needed. The fact that one's worrying about increasing production doesn't mean that one has to, doesn't give one any excuse to ignore the demand side and the government side. People worry that sustainable intensification is special pleading by the agricultural sector, an argument, and some of the agricultural sector actually say this, an argument to go back to supporting production. And I think that's wrong. I think sustainable intensification should be to get an efficient response to price signals. If we're wrong and there isn't a food problem ahead, then we won't get those price signal responses. What we need is to be able to have an efficient response, and an efficient response that doesn't do terrible things to sustainability. So what worries me about food price going up is that, yes, there will be an endogenous response. That endogenous response will lead to terrible environmental externalities, which will not only screw the environment, but undermine the capacity to produce food in the future. Some people see sustainable intensification, see intensification, and are happy with it and ignore sustainability. If you take sustainable intensification seriously, then sustainability is equally as important as intensification. Yes, we care about yields, but other things are important as well. And then the other thing, which upsets some people, is the way I see sustainable intensification is it's both agnostic and Catholic. And by that I mean that it doesn't care about how you get there. It might be through organic, it might be through agroecology, it might be through conventional plant breeding, it might be through GM breeding. The challenges ahead of producing enough food to feed 9 to 10 billion people are such that we don't have the luxury to throw away some elements of our toolkit. And finally, people worry that sustainable intensification is concentrating on only one part of the food system, and I have some sympathies with that, and one needs to coordinate a sustainable intensification agenda with other agendas. For example, nutrition, sustainable development, animal welfare, biodiversity, other things as well. And I think you're putting the PowerPoints up. If you're interested in this, then there's a paper there that explores some of these things in more detail. So what does actually sustainable intensification mean when it comes to priorities for the food system? Now, clearly one could talk about this for hours, and I'm just going to put up 2 slides and speak very briefly, or 1 slide with 2 parts to it, and speak very briefly to it. I think it helps to think about 2 components of increasing yield, one using existing knowledge and the other generating new knowledge. And I think both in the rich world and the small world, we've paid insufficient attention to the human and social capital that feeds into the production function, that feeds into increasing productivity. For different reasons, both in the poor world and the rich world, we've run down extension. So extension services, why bother in the rich world when the problem was overproduction? Why bother in the poor world when there was a dominant belief that the way to help the poorest people was through macroeconomic intervention rather than specified intervention on the ground? I think one can revitalize extension, but one wouldn't want to recreate the extension services that existed 20 years ago. One would want to use the full panoply of data, knowledge, and ICT that is now available. So often, especially in least developed countries, we do not have an economic environment that facilitates people to increase yields. And I think there's now some great examples of where this has worked. When one thinks of the agricultural revolution in Brazil, one tends to think of the big prairie farms, the big industrial. But a lot of Brazil is still smallholder farmers. And governments in Brazil, both of the left and the right, have created an economic environment that capital has been able to go on. So you have this thriving smallholder agricultural sector in Santa Catalina provinces and places like that. And then again, we need to incentivize sustainability, the type of introduce incentives that won't occur naturally through the market, and increase resource efficiency, precision agriculture. So much of waste in the developed, so there's an argument that 30% of all food is wasted. In least developed countries, that's largely on the farm and in storage. There is massive opportunities for leapfrogging technology for that. And then we have to generate new knowledge. There has been a slowdown of investment in agricultural research over the last 4 or 5 decades, and that has now been reflected in a decrease in yields. Now, of course, we could be reaching yield ceilings, but I suspect not. We need to be, again, more broad in what we invest in, high-tech as well as low-tech, neglected crops, neglected breeds, neglected topics, agronomy, soil science, entomology, and issues such as that. We still haven't got it exactly right in the balance between public and private investment. I think that the mantra at the moment expects the private sector to do too much of the hard lifting, and I think there's interesting ideas coming along about we may be underestimating the importance of public investment. It's not just yields, we need investments in sustainability. We need particularly investment in issues of climate change, adaptation, and mitigation, and we need social science research as well. I think many of the economic models that we use in trying to explore how to increase yield aren't working. And I think there may be game changers out there, but as I'm running a bit short on time, I won't talk about that. On the demand side, I think especially in academia and more generally, we're too frightened to talk about issues of population. There is such a good news story that one can have on population about the virtuous circle of if you can get population growth down, you can get the economic returns. Population is difficult to talk about because the issue of population is largely in low-income countries. And I think that when one talks about population, where much of the work is needed in low-income countries, one should talk simultaneously about consumption, where it's us in the rich world that have to make so many of changes. And indeed, one wants one of the talks on climate change said that in the poorest countries, consumption emissions need to go up before they go down. On the demand side, there are multiple wins in health, food security, and the environment. These need to be articulated better. We have an insufficient understanding of the levers of diet change, how one can get diets to change. The empirical base for this is beginning to Sorry. Can I have another minute? That's fine. It's not over till the duck quacks. We're beginning to get a good empirical base about what works with diet change, and it's not very encouraging. Education helps, but not very much. Labeling helps, but not very much. If we really want to make action on diet, we need to legitimize our politicians to do things that will restrict choice. And politicians won't do that unless they're legitimized by public discourse. And it's not an exact parallel, but... Oh, that's not me. Did you set it for 20 minutes as well? It's not an exact parallel, but we've known that tobacco kills us since the 1960s. And it's only in the last 10 years that governments have been allowed by their populace to ban smoking in restaurants and things like this. Very briefly, some of the governance challenges. These are the things that, not completely in the purview of the G20, but the G20 can help. We're at the end game of landscapes, of land use. There is no new land being produced, the old joke. We have to think about multifunctional landscapes. We have to stop the lunacy of biofuels policy, at least lunacy in Europe and America, and think about climate-smart agriculture. We do not have the luxury of land producing nothing. And when I say producing, I don't necessarily mean food or fibre or wood. It might be ecosystem services, it might be biodiversity. But we need to think about multifunctional landscapes with all lands producing something. We need to be better at regulating common goods and bads. As a scientist, I normally say we need more research. We don't need more research on how to manage fisheries, or not a lot of it. We need the political will to implement what we know already, and similarly for many of the things in carbon and carbon change. I very much believe that Stiglitz has it right when he talks about we're stuck with globalization, make globalization work in favor of food security. As climate change, the effects of climate change become greater, we'll get greater and larger production shocks. We need to craft a global food system that enables an interconnected level of interconnected bread baskets where one region can supplement for another. The critical thing here is trust in time of crisis, but we can see it working. You only have to compare what happened in the price shocks of 2008 and 2010 for rice. In 2008, rice was highly volatile. The ASEAN nations got together in 2010. They had procedures in place that meant that rice was the least volatile of the grains. I'm going to skip those last two ones. These are my conclusions. The food system is entering uncharted waters. And I think one of the greatest challenges for policymakers is to get out of the mindset of using what's happened in the past as a guide for the future. We're really in a new area. Action is needed on all fronts on the food system. It's a no-regret thing in many ways. Supply, demand, and governance. I would argue, and this is something I'm particularly interested in, that's sustainable intensification. If you don't like the name, call it something else. But what it means is actually essential. It's almost a logical deduction rather than an argument. I'm a scientist. I wouldn't be allowed back into Oxford if I didn't call for more research. And we need new thinking on consumption and governance. And I think my final point is whatever you care about, climate change, biodiversity, indigenous peoples, we have to care about food. If we fail on food, we fail in everything. Quentin, sorry for going over a few minutes.